During the 1990s, Williams and Renault were the team and engine combination. Between 1992 and 1997, Renault won every single one of the Constructors' Championships, or at least powered the Constructors' Champions, and Williams took 4 of the 6 Drivers' Championships that were on offer. Mansell, Prost, Hill and Villeneuve were the 4 Drivers' Champions. Mansell in 92, Prost in 93, Hill in 96 and Villeneuve in 1997. Mansell's championship was a walk in the park, given how good the FW14B was. Prost had a slightly harder time due to McLaren and Senna closing the gap, but also Prost wasn't able to adapt to active cars much. Hill also had an easy-ish walk to a title. His only competition came from his teammate, who would then win the championship himself the following year, albeit in highly controversial circumstances at Jerez. Also, for a period between 1994 and 1997, Williams was associated with Rothmans cigarettes. This resulted in a colour scheme of blue and white with gold and red accents. Something so simple, but also stood out on the TV broadcasts of the time, because 720, 1080, 4K, none of that was in our homes at that time. But in 1998, things changed. Renault left Formula 1 at the end of 1997, and Williams had to go through the next 2 years with 1997 engines prepped by Mechachrome. Also, it was out with the blue and in with the red because Rothmans wanted to promote its Winfield brand. The result was this, essentially the 1997 car tuned to the 1998 regulations. Grooved tyres, narrower track and some other small bits and pieces that you really need to look for to notice the differences. On top of this, Adrian Newey had left for McLaren, and it would be Hakkinen versus Schumacher for the next couple of years, as opposed to it being Villeneuve defending his title against Schumacher. The red Williams cars have their own dedicated video done on them, so we won't hang around too much with all of this because it's either a video you can go and watch after you've watched this one, or you've already seen it if you're a long-time viewer. I will try to leave a link, a card or something so you can go and watch it afterwards. But in 2000, Williams had an all-new look. In the words of Mark Hughes, it should have been mega, but for whatever reason, it never reached its full potential. The deal with BMW was signed in 1998, leaving Williams to cope with substandard engines for 2 seasons, and it would also give BMW enough time to design and build an engine that would be able to cope with the big bad world of Formula 1. This also wasn't BMW's first rodeo in Formula 1. In the mid-1980s, they'd managed to build a 1.5-litre, turbocharged inline-4 capable of an estimated 1,400 horsepower. This was for qualifying only, and they never ran those power figures in the race. I cannot stress this enough. It would, though, be BMW's first attempt at building a 3-litre V10 for use in Formula 1, and BMW had thought about entering a factory team into F1 as early as 1990, getting Nick Wirth at Simtech to design the cars for them, but they then decided that they were going to stay and focus on DTM instead, and those blueprints were later sold to Andrea Sassetti, who used them to then build the Andrea motor cars in 1992. So there's some bonus facts everywhere in these videos. So, coming into the new millennium, it was going to be a manufacturer with a history of designing and building cars with a racing pedigree, matched up with the team that had basically controlled Formula 1 since the latter part of the 1991 season up until the start of 1998. BMW would use a Williams car as a test mule through 1999 to make sure the engine would work. The 2000 season would be the big reveal, as Williams had completely changed. What had happened was British American Tobacco had bought the Rothmans brand and BAT had its own team in British American Racing. They didn't want to have their products on rival cars, so chose not to renew the sponsorship deal with Williams, leaving them without tobacco sponsorship. Instead, the car was decked out in the logos of technology companies like Compaq and Nortel, as well as an online casino. While other teams were still running the likes of Marlboro, West, Benson and Hedges and Goulart, Williams' new tech-focused image had them sign an anti-smoking aid in nicotine. And the livery was a callback to what had appeared on those Brabham cars in the 1980s, instead of the traditional red, white and blue M colours that you would normally associate with a hot BMW. Driving one of the cars would be Ralf Schumacher. He moved to Williams after Michael bought out his contract after the 1998 Belgian Grand Prix, and with him was a very, very fresh-faced Jenson Button. Essentially, Zanardi, who had been in the car the previous year, had endured a horrible season. He didn't score a single point, and Zanardi was supposed to be at Williams through 2000 as well. Due to the poor season, Williams paid off Zanardi's contract and he went back to America. Button, meanwhile, would be a stopgap solution until Williams' deal with Chip Ganassi ended and Montoya, who had been sent to Ganassi, could come back. BMW went for a conservative approach for the 2000 season. The engine was in a way similar to the Mechachrome and Supertech units that had been in the car before, with similar V-angles, similar power, similar torque and all that other stuff. Schumacher was third on BMW's return at Melbourne, while Button retired, but at the following round in Brazil, both cars were in the points, with Button being the then youngest point scorer. He was only about 3 months into his 20s or something along those lines. The San Marino Grand Prix saw double retirements, but both cars often found themselves in the points. 36 points saw them finish third overall, but way behind Ferrari and McLaren as Hakkinen was beaten by Schumacher and Ferrari took its first driver's title in over 20 years. It shows how uncompetitive that year was when Williams scored one less point than they had done the year before, but finished higher in the constructors. But already there were problems. In 1998, BMW had posted losses, and the chairman, and apologies if I get this completely wrong, Bernd Pischetschreider, I think, had resigned as a result. Replacing him was Joachim Milberg, and because the contracts had already been signed and he was having to mop up this hurricane of piss, he basically said, "We're spending a lot of money I don't want to be spending. You're not supposed to be fighting Jordan and Benetton for scraps of points. You need to be fighting McLaren and Ferrari. I want results." It also didn't help matters that Paul Roche, who was the guy that helped Brabham through their BMW years, had been paid by BMW to go into retirement. So the two people that should have been Frank and Patrick's boys through this whole thing were now gone, and they'd been replaced by people that weren't racing or engineering minded, but more financially minded, which seems to happen a lot. I mean, look at Boeing. In 2001, Frank farmed Jensen out to Benetton, and after many, many years, he was finally able to get Juan Pablo Montoya in. Frank's first time bringing in an IndyCar driver in Villeneuve had gone well. The second, Zanardi, although he'd gone from Formula 1 to kart and then come back again, didn't work out so well. But Montoya had enjoyed a decent European ladder career, and he'd crushed it in the States as well. And he'd come from a similar mould as Villeneuve, aggressive, fast, and said whatever was on his mind. One of my favourites as a kid, and still is now. The livery changed slightly for 2001. The blue was more blue, and that was about it. But really, this car was, well, it was pretty much all engine. BMW, presumably because of pressure from the top, went in a bit harder for 2001. The engine power had increased by about 100 horsepower and had 30 horsepower on the Ferrari and Mercedes engines. So at Hockenheim and Monza, brilliant. Everywhere else where the car had to do more turning than go in a straight line, it was found out. The McLaren and Ferrari were still the best cars overall. The Williams chassis wasn't terrible, and it was a substantial improvement on the previous car, but it was just being outperformed by what Newey and Braun could come up with. The car was also running Michelins. They were in their first year of Formula 1 and they were sort of behind Bridgestone on the whole development front. McLaren at this time was still on Bridgestone, so they were still a little bit ahead in terms of the whole tyre development and the whole tyre war that had just begun. But when the tracks were hot, the Michelins really started to turn on. Despite the improved power, the engine tended to give up and high downforce tracks were a struggle. You can see how unreliable the car was with the sea of purple that's on display here. Montoya could not catch a break, it seems, and he also made several mistakes as he adjusted to life in Formula 1 after being in kart. But the car did score more points in this season, the car scoring more podiums and a total of 4 wins over the course of the season, 3 for Ralph and 1 for JPM. Imagine what would have been if the car had been more reliable. Montoya also showed the F1 world that he had the ability when he made the most of his rolling start experience to catch the Michael off guard and take the lead. More of that in a Montoya retrospective, I feel, because I don't want to turn this video into JPM's greatest hits. And yes, when I do that video, I'll include the broken head bit. But for 2002, BMW had to improve. Losing to Ferrari wasn't so bad because it was a case of the better team winning. That's just sport. But they were losing to Mercedes, a fellow German company, and they couldn't have that. There was a BMW ad campaign at the end of the 2001 season that likely piled some pressure on Williams. It basically read 2000 podiums, 2001 victories, 2002. Now 2002 started off pretty okay, all things considered. Montoya would be second in Australia, and then the two cars came home 1-2 for the first time since Villeneuve led Hill home at the 1996 Portuguese Grand Prix, and in doing so, they beat Schumacher and Ferrari. But as the anoraks will be quick to point out, they'd beaten the F2001. not the F2002. Schumacher and Ferrari would then go on to dominate the rest of the season, with the Michael not finishing off the podium all year in an absolutely mesmerising season that was giving people, at least at the time, flashbacks to 1988. Except he was doing it by himself for the most part. BMW's ad campaign hadn't matched their internal expectations. The atmosphere between Williams and BMW was now so cold that Andorrians would find it quite comfortable. But either way, Schumacher and Ferrari were just too good that year. However, the car was a lot more reliable and more points were scored as Williams went on to take second in the Constructors' Championship, their highest result since 1997. Montoya was third in the Drivers'. The only problem was that while they'd made the car more reliable and they'd beaten McLaren with their Mercedes power, Ferrari had gone and turned things up to 11. Maybe 2003 would be a much better season, closing the gap to Ferrari with an improvement on the chassis, the tyres and the engine, and then they could try and stop Schumacher. I'm going to try and focus solely on Williams' performance here because the 2003 season was one that should have been one for the ages, but ended up being quite controversial and a bit deflating towards the end. What happened was there was a bit of a spat because Ferrari, running Bridgestones, had complained to the FIA that Michelin, and by extension McLaren, Williams and Renault, were running illegal tyres. Tyres that had been using the same construction since the 2001 San Marino Grand Prix. 2003 was much closer because McLaren and Williams, which were running Michelin rubber, started to really pick up pace during the European season. If you remember all the way back to 2003, that summer was hot. Ridiculously hot in Europe. So the Michelins, which needed hot weather to work properly, started closing the gap. But it wasn't just the rubber lucking out with the temperatures that we were seeing in Europe at that time. Williams had also built a half-decent car. Basically, Williams had taken the previous car and chucked it in the bin. Instead of improving on what they had, they decided to change everything. The 2002 car had run less downforce than the Ferrari and the McLaren, and it was shredding tyres, even ones as durable as those Michelins. So Williams had to start from scratch to build a car that was better on tyres and would carry that BMW engine to some more consistent podium results, and maybe even more wins. BMW had managed to build an engine capable of 900 horsepower and was also the first to go beyond 19,000 RPM. If the car could match the engine, they'd be flying. Montoya had put that 2002 car on pole at Monaco by nearly half a second. Essentially, the 2002 car was a hot lap merchant. It got 7 poles over the course of the year, but it just couldn't do it in the race because it was disintegrating the tyres. As proof of how fast that thing was, Montoya's lap around Monza, which was 160 miles an hour average, was the fastest ever seen in Formula 1 at that time. The FW25 had a shorter wheelbase than what they'd run before, making it a lot more agile, and the styling was a bit more aggressive too. Looking back, it was quite a nice looking car, really. Jeff Willis left the team mid-2002 and he'd been replaced by the late Andrea Terzi, who used to work for Ferrari, who then worked with Gavin Fisher to get everything working as best they could. But in the opening round of the season, Montoya spun off while leading. He'd done exactly the same thing the previous year and that's why he was second, but the car was definitely getting there. It was just a case of both Montoya and Ralph trying to figure out the right way to drive it because of the way it was balanced. Montoya's aggressive driving style suited it a bit more, but the car did suffer from native understeer that Williams sought to tune out as quickly as possible. It took almost half the season for the car to come alive. At Monaco, the Williams car started first and third, Ralph on pole and Montoya back in, well, third, and both cars romped off into the lead as Montoya got up to second off the line. Ralph would finish fourth, but Montoya would win, and after that Williams made full advantage of the hot European summer that year with their Michelin tyres to win 3 more races, score many more podiums, and Montoya would actually be leading the championship at one point. But then after the Hungarian Grand Prix, Ferrari and Bridgestone's appeal was accepted, and Michelin had to hurriedly alter the construction of its tyres. The Williams would not win another race all season. This, coupled with a bizarre penalty for Montoya at the US Grand Prix, meant that he would finish third overall in the standings behind Raikkonen, who in turn was pipped by Schumacher. This would be the closest that BMW would ever get to winning the championship. Like I said, I covered all of that in a full video I did a couple of years ago. I was definitely in the old flat when I made that video, but it's definitely out there somewhere. Again, I'll try and leave a link. But the whole thing was just a bit deflating. It halted the momentum that McLaren and Williams had, and it all just got a bit too political, but that's just how it was in Formula 1 at that time. 2004 was another season where Ferrari would utterly dominate. It also didn't help this year that Williams tried to go radical with the walrus nose design that, like the 2003 tyre fiasco, has its own video done. Basically, Williams sought to exploit more underbody downforce by designing the nose in this manner, but it didn't really help much. Lotus tried something similar in 2014 and that didn't work particularly well either. When Williams reverted to a more conventional design later on in the season, it improved things slightly, but Ferrari and Schumacher were on one again, much like they were in 2002. By this point, the relationship between the two had really soured. BMW was angry at Williams for not building a good enough car. On top of this, Montoya was moving to McLaren for 2005 while Schumacher was going to Toyota, which left Williams with Mark Webber, who had come from Jaguar, and Nick Heidfeld, who was there because BMW wanted a German driver. It's also the reason that Schumacher was kept on for 2000. It's alleged that Frank preferred Antonio Pizzonia, but Nick wasn't called Quick Nick for nothing, so Frank wasn't too upset with being told he had to have Heidfeld. Once again, BMW was not only critical, but publicly critical of Williams building a bad car, while Williams told BMW that the engine wasn't good enough versus the Renault, Ferrari and Mercedes power units. There was also a contract dispute with Jenson Button that didn't help matters, and despite BMW having a contract with Williams until 2009, the relationship was reaching breaking point. Williams did score 4 podiums in the first half of the season, but then slipped back with points hard to come by in the second half of the season following that race at Indianapolis. So BMW put in an offer to buy Williams so that they could build the cars that they wanted to build. Frank, being Frank, told them to do one, so BMW invested in Sauber instead. So what went wrong then? It's a number of things really. The first is that the people that signed that deal in the first place were removed before it started. Business came before racing, and that's not necessarily a good idea. I used Boeing as the example earlier, and it's not necessarily a meme or a joke, but actually carries some element of truth when people say that McDonnell Douglas bought Boeing with Boeing's money. The engineering and racing-centric attitude had been replaced with, will it make us money, and BMW's demands for results would not have sat well with Frank and Patrick. Frank Williams being an I'll do it my way type while having all that pressure put upon him by the suits at BMW probably didn't help matters either. BMW was trying to rescue profits while Frank wanted to go racing, and that's never going to work in a million years. On top of this, Adrian Newey was now at McLaren, and McLaren was working with Mercedes closer than BMW was with Williams, and that was generating its own kind of success. And then there was what was happening over at Maranello: Schumacher, Brawn and Todd. Something you don't see much of at Maranello these days, and that was a robotic entity working as one piece of collective brilliance, with Nigel Stepney whipping the pit crew into shape with British Army levels of discipline. The differences between Williams and BMW were never going to work against that well-oiled machine. So it makes you wonder then what might have happened if the people at the top of BMW hadn't been replaced prior to them coming into Formula 1. Would the relationship between BMW and Williams been like the relationship they had with Renault? Would the same levels of success have been there? Or was Ferrari and Schumacher just far too good for them? Was it all just the right thing but at the wrong time? But I guess that's one for you lot to discuss down in the comments. So then a look at the it could have been so much better nature of the relationship between Williams and BMW. If this has been an interesting look through the motorsport history books, then do like the video so I know a good job was done. And for more like this, get subscribed with that bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the fine bunch of lads over at Patreon for the continued support, and if you want to help support me at a more personal level, then a link to Patreon is down in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliate links and anything else you might want or need to know. Or there's super thanks down there if you just want to buy me a coffee, and memberships for those that want a Patreon alternative. So until next time, I've been Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.